Tom Briggs was the kind of guy who could fix anything with wheels, an engine, or moving parts. At 42, he'd spent most of his life under the hood of something broken, and he liked it that way. His little repair shop sat on 5 acres of Montana countryside, far enough from town that he could work on loud engines without bothering anybody, and close enough that folks could find him when their trucks decided to quit working. That Tuesday night started like any other. Tom had just finished rebuilding a transmission for Mrs. Peterson's old Chevy and was looking forward to a cold beer and maybe catching a late baseball game on TV. The storm had been rolling in all evening, with thunder that seemed to shake the whole valley. Nothing unusual for Montana in summer. Those mountain storms could get pretty wild. But when the skies suddenly turned bright white at 11:30, Tom knew this wasn't regular lightning. The whole horizon lit up like someone had just set off the world's biggest firework, and the sound that followed wasn't thunder. It was more like a freight train mixed with jet engine, getting louder and louder until it felt like the noise was coming from inside his bones. Then everything went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet you get after a storm passes. The weird kind where even crickets stopped talking. Tom stepped out onto his porch, still holding that unopened beer, and looked around his property. The air smelled different, like hot metal and something sweet he couldn't quite place. His dog Rex was hiding under the porch, whining in a way Tom had never heard before. That's when he noticed the orange glow coming from behind his tool shed. Now, Tom had seen plenty of strange things in his 42 years. He'd pulled engines out of cars that had been rolled 3 times and somehow still ran. He'd fixed tractors that had been struck by lightning. He'd even worked on a motorcycle that had been underwater for 2 weeks. But what he found in his backyard that night was something else entirely. The crash site looked like someone had dropped the house from about 1,000 feet up. Tom's vegetable garden was completely flattened, and there was a furrow carved into the earth that stretched back about 50 yards. At the end of that furrow sat something that definitely hadn't come from any factory on Earth. The ship, and Tom's brain had no trouble calling it a ship, was roughly the size of his pickup truck. But that's where the similarities ended. Instead of straight lines and flat surfaces, this thing was all curves and angles that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The hull appeared to be made of some kind of dark metal that had a rainbow sheen to it, like oil on water. Panels along the sides glowed with a soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. But what really got Tom's attention was the figure stumbling around next to the wreckage. At first glance, it looked almost human. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head where you'd expect to find one. But as Tom got closer, he could see that's where the similarities ended. The being's skin wasn't skin at all, but something that looked like living crystal. It caught the glow from the ship and scattered it in tiny rainbows across its surface. The creature was roughly his height, but thinner, like it was built for a world with lighter gravity. And it was hurt. Bad. Blue fluid. Tom figured it was probably blood, though it glowed faintly in the dark, was seeping from several cracks along the creature's left side. It moved like someone with a few broken ribs. Careful and slow, one hand pressed against its side, while the other gestured frantically at the damaged ship. The sounds it made weren't quite words, but they didn't need to be. Tom had heard that same desperate tone from customers whose cars had broken down on the way to the hospital, or farmers whose tractors had died right in the middle of harvest season. It was a universal sound of someone who needed help, needed it now, and was running out of options. Most folks probably would have run straight back to the house and called every government agency they could think of, but Tom had never been most folks. He'd spent his whole life looking at broken things and figuring out how to make them work again. And right now, looking at this injured creature standing next to its damaged ship, all he could see was another repair job that needed doing. So Tom did what Tom always did when faced with something broken. He walked back to his tool shed, grabbed his toolbox and a heavy-duty flashlight, and got ready to work. Tom approached the damaged ship with the same methodical attitude he brought to every repair job. The crystal being, he decided to call it Crystal for simplicity, was still making those urgent clicking sounds and pointing at different parts of the vessel. Even though they couldn't speak each other's language, Tom could read the situation pretty clearly. This thing needed to get home, and fast. The first challenge was figuring out where to even start. Tom had fixed everything from lawn mowers to combined harvesters, but alien technology was definitely a first. He walked slowly around the ship, shining his flashlight over the hull, looking for anything that might give him a clue about how this thing worked. The damage was pretty obvious once he knew what to look for. There was a large section on the underside of the ship where the metal had been torn away, exposing what Tom could only assume were the guts of propulsion system. Twisted cables hung loose, sparking occasionally with that same blue energy that seemed to power everything on the ship. Several cylindrical objects that might have been engines were cracked open, leaking that glowing blue fluid onto the ground. Crystal kept gesturing at these damaged parts, then at the sky, then back at the ship. The message was clear enough. These were the parts that made it fly, and they were definitely not flying anymore. Tom crouched down next to the exposed machinery, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. The technology was unlike anything he'd ever seen, but the basic physics had to be the same, right? Energy goes in, gets converted somehow, and pushes the ship forward. It was the same principle that drove every engine he'd ever worked on, just with parts that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. The crystal being seemed to understand what Tom was doing and started pulling panels off other parts of the ship, showing him more of the internal systems. Tom could see the creature was getting weaker. That blue fluid was still seeping from the wounds, but it was determined to help with the repairs. What struck Tom most was how similar this alien technology was to human engineering, once he got past the fancy materials and glowing parts. There were obvious power conduits running from what looked like a central generator to propulsion units. There were control systems that seemed to regulate the flow of energy. There were even what appeared to be safety cutoffs that had triggered when the ship crashed. The problem was that several key components were completely fried. The power couplings that connected the main energy source to the engines were melted. The magnetic field generators that Tom guessed helped with propulsion were cracked beyond repair, and the control matrix that seemed to coordinate everything was sparking and smoking. This is where Tom's 30 years of creative problem-solving kicked in. He'd learned long ago that when you can't find the right part, you make do with what you have. And what Tom had was a garage full of automotive parts, electrical components, and the kind of random hardware that every good mechanic accumulates over the years. He started with the power couplings. The alien ones were made of some kind of crystal material that conducted that blue energy, but Tom figured electricity was electricity. He had some heavy-gauge copper wire in his truck, the kind used for welding equipment. It wasn't pretty, but copper was one of the best conductors he knew. For the magnetic field generators, Tom remembered the old speakers he'd pulled out of his truck last month. The magnets in those speakers were industrial grade, designed to handle serious power. With some creative positioning and a lot of electrical tape, he managed to create a magnetic field configuration that seemed to approximate what the original alien components had been doing. The control matrix was the trickiest part. Tom didn't have anything that could replace the sophisticated alien computer system. But he did have something else, an old alternator from a diesel truck. Alternators were basically electromagnetic regulators, designed to control the flow of electrical current. With some rewiring and a few components from an old radio, Tom rigged up a system that could at least manage the power flow to the improvised engines. Crystal watched all of this with what Tom could only describe as fascination. Every time Tom jury-rigged another connection or improvised another component, the alien would make these soft clicking sounds that almost sounded like laughter. Whether it was laughing at Tom's primitive solutions or with genuine amusement, Tom couldn't tell, but the creature seemed increasingly hopeful as the repairs progressed. The real test came when Tom connected his makeshift power system to the ship's main energy source. There was a moment of silence, then a low humming sound that gradually grew stronger. The blue glow from the ship's panels brightened, and Tom could feel a subtle vibration running through the hull. Then, impossibly, the ship began to rise. It was only a few inches at first, wobbling unsteadily like a helicopter with a damaged rotor. But as Tom's improvised system stabilized, the ship lifted smoothly into the air, hovering about 3 feet off the ground with a steady, confident hum. Crystal turned to look at Tom with what he swore was amazement in those faceted eyes, pressed something warm and smooth into his palm, and climbed back into the cockpit. Tom Briggs had always been a heavy sleeper. 20 years of falling asleep to the sound of diesel engines and air compressors had trained him to sleep through just about anything. But the sound that woke him up at 6:30 that morning wasn't something you could ignore, no matter how tired you were. Helicopters. Multiple helicopters. And they weren't the bright yellow traffic copters you see on the morning news, or even the red and white rescue helicopters from the hospital. These are the kind of helicopters that didn't show up in any civilian aviation database. Black, sleek, and completely silent except for the barely audible whir of their rotors. Tom rolled out of bed and stumbled to his bedroom window, still wearing yesterday's work clothes. What he saw in his front yard made him wonder if he was still dreaming. 3 aircraft that looked more like something from a science fiction movie than anything the military usually flew were positioned around his property in a perfect triangle. They hovered about 50 feet off the ground, completely motionless, like they were anchored to invisible posts in the sky. But the helicopters weren't what made Tom's stomach drop. It was the people on the ground. At least a dozen men and women in identical black suits were setting up some kind of equipment around his house. They moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing the same job many times before. Some were carrying briefcases that definitely weren't from the local office supply store. Others were positioning devices that looked like satellite dishes, all pointed at his house. A few were stringing what appeared to be sensors around the perimeter of his property. Tom pulled on his boots and headed for the front door, but stopped when he saw who was waiting for him on his porch. Agent Davis was exactly the kind of person you'd expect to see climbing out of those black helicopters. She was probably in her 40s, with short gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested military training. Her suit was expensive but practical, and she wore it like armor. When Tom opened his front door, she was standing there with a tablet in one hand and what looked like a very sophisticated scanner in the other. "Mr. Briggs," she said without any preamble, "we need to discuss the events that occurred on your property approximately 7 hours ago." Tom had been planning to play dumb, maybe suggested she had the wrong address or that he'd been asleep all night. But something about Agent Davis made it clear that lying wasn't going to be an option. She had the look of someone who already knew all the answers and was just being polite by asking the questions. "I'm not sure what you mean." Tom tried anyway. Agent Davis glanced at her scanner, which was beeping softly and displaying what appeared to be a 3-dimensional map of Tom's property. Several areas were highlighted in red, including the exact spot where the alien ship had crashed. "Mr. Briggs, we have satellite footage of an unidentified craft landing in your backyard at 11:47 p.m. last night. We have thermal imaging showing 2 figures moving around the crash site for approximately 3 hours. And we have electromagnetic readings that suggest advanced technology was activated on your property around 2:30 a.m. She looked up from the scanner. "Would you like to revise your statement?" Tom realized there wasn't much point in denying what had obviously been recorded from space. "Okay, yeah, something crashed in my backyard. But how did you guys know about it so fast? And why do you care?" Agent Davis stepped closer, and Tom could see that her scanner was focused on something in his pocket. The crystal device that the alien had given him was apparently putting out some kind of signal that her equipment could detect. "Mr. Briggs, you're the 23rd person this month to report contact with non-terrestrial entities. More importantly, you're the 23rd person to successfully repair extraterrestrial technology using nothing but common Earth materials and human ingenuity." Tom felt like the ground had just shifted under his feet. 23rd? You mean this has happened before? "It's been happening more and more frequently over the past 6 months, Agent Davis explained. "Every time, the pattern is the same. An alien vessel experiences mechanical failure and makes an emergency landing. A human civilian provides assistance, usually someone with mechanical or engineering experience. The alien technology is repaired using improvised methods that shouldn't work according to our understanding of physics. And the alien departs, usually leaving behind some kind of device or artifact." She pointed at Tom's pocket, where the crystal device was apparently glowing brighter. "That object you're carrying is putting out energy readings that our best scientists can't explain. It's the same type of device that's been left behind in all 22 previous incidents." Tom pulled the crystal out of his pocket and looked at it more carefully in the morning light. It was about the size of a baseball, perfectly smooth, and warm to the touch. Inside the transparent surface, he could see what looked like tiny stars moving in complex patterns. "What does it do?" Tom asked. That's what we're trying to figure out, Agent Davis replied. What we do know is that every human who's received one of these devices has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceed normal parameters. They've solved engineering challenges that have stumped our top researchers. They've repaired equipment that should be beyond current human understanding. She paused and looked directly at Tom. Mr. Briggs, we think these aren't random encounters. We think you and the others are being tested. Agent Davis motioned for Tom to sit down on his own porch steps, which felt strange considering this was his property, and these were uninvited guests. But something about the way she carried herself suggested that what she was about to tell him was going to change everything he thought he knew about the world. Mr. Briggs, what I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels, but given your involvement, you have a right to know. She settled onto the step beside him, her scanner still quietly beeping as it monitored the crystal device in Tom's hand. Earth isn't alone in the universe. I think you figured that out last night, but what you probably don't know is that we're currently under evaluation. Tom looked around at all the equipment and personnel scattered across his property. Evaluation for what? Membership in what they call the Galactic Confederation. Think of it as a cosmic version of the United Nations, except instead of countries, it's entire civilizations. There are over 400 species currently involved, spread across this part of the galaxy. They handle trade, territorial disputes, technology sharing, that sort of thing. Tom tried to wrap his head around what she was saying. And they're considering letting Earth join? That's where it gets complicated. Agent Davis continued. Most species follow a predictable pattern when they develop technology. They start with basic tools, gradually improve them over thousands of years, build on previous discoveries, test everything extensively before implementing changes. It's slow, careful, methodical. She pointed at the crystal device Tom was holding. Every species that's ever joined the Confederation followed this same pattern, except humans. Tom looked down at the crystal, which seemed to be pulsing slightly brighter as Agent Davis talked. What's different about humans? Everything, she said with something that might have been admiration in her voice. Humans don't follow rules when it comes to problem solving. You look at something that should be impossible and say, what if we try this crazy idea instead? You take technologies from completely different fields and mash them together in ways that shouldn't work, but somehow do. Agent Davis pulled out her tablet and showed Tom a series of photos. Each one showed a different person standing next to what was obviously alien technology. A farmer in Iowa next to a crash scout ship, a plumber in Texas holding some kind of alien tool, a mechanic in Detroit working on what looked like an alien motorcycle. Every one of these people did the same thing you did last night, she explained. They fixed alien technology using ordinary Earth materials and human creativity. The aliens are amazed every single time, according to their databases. This should be impossible. Tom studied the photos more carefully. These weren't scientists or engineers with advanced degrees. They were regular people, working people, the kind of folks who solve problems with their hands and their gut instincts rather than computer simulations and theoretical models. The crystal device you're holding? Agent Davis continued. It's not a thank you gift. It's a test. According to our alien contacts, it's designed to be impossible to activate. The puzzle it contains has stumped some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. They had teams of their best scientists working on identical devices for decades without success. Tom looked at the crystal again, remembering how he'd absent-mindedly been turning it over in his hands while Agent Davis talked. The patterns inside had been shifting and changing, responding to his touch in ways that seemed almost alive. How long did it take you to figure out? She asked. Tom thought back to the previous night. After the alien ship had taken off, he'd sat on his porch for a while, examining the crystal the creature had given him. It had seemed natural to trace the patterns on its surface with his finger, following the moving lights inside. Without really thinking about it, he'd started pressing different areas in sequence, like he was playing some kind of three-dimensional puzzle game. Maybe 20 minutes, he admitted. Agent Davis nodded grimly. The Confederation has scared Mr. Briggs. Some of their member species are pushing for Earth to be quarantined until we mature enough to think like everyone else. They're worried that if humans get access to advanced technology, we'll use our creative problem-solving in ways they can't predict or control. Tom could understand their concern. Humans did have a reputation for taking new technology and using it in ways the inventors never intended. Give a human a tool designed for one specific purpose, and within a week someone would figure out 17 other things it could do. But other species see the potential. Agent Davis continued. They have problems that their methodical, careful approach can't solve. Challenges that require someone willing to try impossible solutions. They want to recruit humans as problem solvers for issues that have stumped them for centuries. She stood up and looked out over Tom's property, where her team was still collecting data and monitoring the area where the alien ship had landed. The tests are getting more frequent and more complex. The Confederation is trying to understand exactly how human creativity works and whether it's something they can control or predict. Your success last night, and the success of the other 22 humans, is forcing them to make a decision about Earth's future. Tom held up the crystal device, watching the lights dance inside its transparent surface. What kind of decision? Agent Davis turned back to face him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Tom saw something like uncertainty in her expression. Whether humanity is ready for the galaxy, or whether the galaxy is ready for humanity. 3 days after Agent Davis and her team had packed up their equipment and disappeared as quietly as they'd arrived, Tom was back to his normal routine. He'd just finished installing a new transmission in Billy Henderson's pickup when the sky lit up again. But this time, it wasn't just one ship. Vex-High's crystalline form emerged from the lead vessel. But this time, the alien wasn't alone. 6 other beings followed, each one clearly from a different species. Tom counted what looked like a walking tree, something that resembled a giant insect with too many arms, a creature that seemed to be made entirely of flowing liquid metal, and others that defied easy description. They moved with the kind of careful dignity that suggested these weren't just random tourists stopping by for repairs. Agent Davis materialized from somewhere. Tom was starting to suspect the government never really stopped watching his property, along with a team of translators and scientists. The whole group gathered in Tom's garage, which suddenly felt way too small for what was apparently going to be the most important meeting in human history. Vex-High spoke first, with the translation coming through some kind of device that one of the other aliens carried. The voice that emerged was surprisingly warm and familiar, nothing like the clicking sounds a crystal being had made during their first encounter. Tom Briggs of Earth, the translated voice said, "You have demonstrated abilities that challenge our understanding of problem solving. We represent the Evaluation Council of the Galactic Confederation, and we have come to offer your species a final test." Tom looked around the garage at all the serious faces, alien and human alike, staring at him. What kind of test? The walking tree creature stepped forward and activated a holographic display that filled the center of the garage. Tom found himself looking at what appeared to be a solar system, with 6 planets orbiting a massive red star. But something was clearly wrong with the star. It was pulsing irregularly, and sections of its surface seemed to be collapsing inward. "This is the Kepler 442 system," the tree creature explained to the translator. "Home to 6 inhabited worlds with a combined population of over 12 billion beings. Their sun is dying, collapsing in a way that will destroy all life in the system within the next standard year." Tom studied the hologram, watching the star's erratic behavior. "Can't they just evacuate?" "Impossible," replied the insect-like being. "The logistics of moving 12 billion individuals would take decades, even with our most advanced transportation. The collapse will happen too quickly." The liquid metal creature flowed closer to the display and manipulated the hologram to show more detailed data. "Our best astrophysicists have been working on this problem for 37 standard years. Every computer simulation, every theoretical model, every possible solution we have tested leads to the same conclusion. The star cannot be stabilized." Agent Davis stepped forward. "And you want Tom to solve this?" Vex-High's crystalline surface shimmered with what Tom was learning to recognize as emotion. "If Tom Briggs can find a solution that our combined civilizations cannot, Earth will be granted full membership in the Galactic Confederation with all the benefits that entails. If he cannot, humanity will remain isolated until such time as your species demonstrates more conventional development patterns." Tom felt the weight of the entire planet settling on his shoulders. 12 billion lives. The future humanity, and the hopes of 6 different civilizations, all depending on a small-town mechanic from Montana. He walked over to the holographic display and started studying the data more carefully. The star was definitely dying, but not in the way Tom would have expected. Instead of simply burning out or exploding, it seemed to be collapsing inward while simultaneously losing mass. The gravitational field was becoming unstable, which was causing the planet's orbits to decay. But what caught Tom's attention was the pattern of the collapse. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, like an engine that was misfiring. "Can I see the magnetic field data?" Tom asked. The aliens exchanged glances, or whatever passed for glances among their various species, and updated the display. Tom studied the new information for several minutes, occasionally asking questions about energy output, solar wind patterns, and gravitational fluctuations. Finally, he stepped back from the display. "I think I see the problem." The silence in the garage was absolute. 12 of the galaxy's most advanced scientists waited to hear what a human mechanic had figured out in an hour that they'd missed in 37 years. "This star isn't dying naturally," Tom explained. "It's like an engine that's lost its timing. The magnetic field that controls the fusion process has gotten out of sync with the gravitational compression. Instead of working together, they're fighting each other." Tom walked over to his workbench and started pulling out materials: copper wire, rare earth magnets from old speakers, some high-voltage capacitors he'd salvaged from a broken air conditioner, and a few of the components that any decent garage would have lying around. "What are you doing?" Agent Davis asked. "Building a timing chain," Tom replied, already deep in problem-solving mode. "If this star is like an engine that's lost its timing, then we need to build something that can get the magnetic field and gravity working together again." What Tom constructed over the next 6 hours looked like something a mad scientist might build in a B-grade science fiction movie. It was a complex arrangement of electromagnetic coils, field generators, and control circuits that he scaled up using mathematical principles he'd learned from repairing alternators and generators. The aliens watched in fascination as Tom essentially built a giant version of the timing system from a diesel engine, adapted to work with stellar magnetic fields instead of pistons and crankshafts. When they deployed Tom's device using Confederation technology, the results were immediate. The dying star's erratic pulsing smoothed out, its magnetic field stabilized, and the gravitational collapse stopped. 12 billion lives were saved by a mechanic who'd approached an impossible cosmic problem the same way he'd approach a misfiring truck engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Vexhai began making those clicking sounds that Tom now recognized as laughter. "We understand now," the crystal being said. "Humans don't see impossible problems. You see interesting puzzles." Earth got its membership that day, and Tom became the galaxy's first official problem solver, proving that sometimes the best tool for the job isn't the most advanced one. It's the one held by someone too stubborn to accept that something can't be fixed.